email you email the recording.
All right, sounds good.
Perfect. And then you can also just, this is going to be annoying, so you can
just copy your file.
Okay.
hide this, and then put this in the corner. All right, cool.
All right, sounds good.
Perfect.
Yeah, the entire contents of the folder. Don't copy the folder. Just everything inside. Copy it to a new. Okay. So try that, and then I'll look the outside. I'll be on the outside. Okay. Are we ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started for today. I see it's a rainy day, so attendance is low, but welcome anyways. So just to clarify from last week, we set up GitHub Classroom, which means that if you're not registered for GitHub Classroom already, please do that ASAP so that we can maintain our roster. We're going to be changing the Git configuration around that because right now it's kind of confusing. So basically, the way that we did it before was to prevent, was to make sure, basically maintain academic integrity. But we've decided that in order to simplify the workflow, we're just going to have to make all the repos public. So that comes with two downsides. Number one, you're going to have to search for your repo a little bit because there's going to be hundreds of repos to search through. And the second is that you will be able to see all of your classmates' repos. So that inherently, I know, is a little bit questionable for some people. So if you would like your repo to be private, i.e. you don't want other people to see your GitHub pages, feel free to reach out to us and we will independently move you to a different workflow so that you can keep your repo private, okay? But basically the overarching message is that I will change the instructions for how to accept an assignment for GitHub Classroom. And more importantly, we're not going to be implementing that until Project 2. So every assignment up until then, please use the normal submission method, meaning make it in your own repo and then post the link or submit the link to your pages on Gradescope. And then when it comes time to submit via GitHub Classroom, I will release more instructions. But until then, make sure to do the starter assignment. And by do, there's nothing to turn in. Just configure it. That's it. You're not turning in anything. There's no Gradescope assignment. It's just a way to make sure. It's like a dummy assignment to make sure that you're registered with Classroom. Once you're registered, you don't need to worry about it. There's nothing to submit for it. Okay, is that clear to everybody? Okay, are there any questions? Okay, if anyone has any admin questions or Git setup questions, my office hours are on Fridays, so feel free to drop in for like administrative or Git questions. Or as usual, you're welcome to make a post on Piazza or comment on one of the threads if you have any extra questions. With that, I will pass it on to Neil for today's lecture.
All right, hey everyone. Hope you guys are having a wonderful Tuesday. Today we're going to be learning about JavaScript 2 and the DOM. And I'm here with Amir, who will be teaching the latter part of our lesson. Okay, so we're going to get started with what is a browser. And so a browser consists of two things, the client and a server. So basically these two parts, they interact with each other such that your code is able to show up on a server and people can visit your code, visit your web page, and be able to check out your website. So specifically, a browser locates, displays, and retrieves content. In the case of the internet, this would be web pages requested by a client from a server. And this information is transferred through HTML. And this information is anything from images, links, different websites, like maybe your website goes to another page or things like that. So browser is capable of handling all of that. And even more specifically, so typically when we make a website, as you guys have all done in your homeworks, you use a server on localhost. Well, you can actually host your website on another server like AWS and use something like GoDaddy or Bluehost in order to host your website. So when someone wants to visit this website, your browser will make a request to it, and it will specifically ask for your index.html file. So your server will send a copy of the index.html file, and the browser will read it, and it will see that there's a JavaScript tag on it. So it will inquire for more JavaScript pages. And that's when your server sends the myscript.js file to your browser, and now your browsers will be able to execute the JavaScript on that page. So basically, yeah, it just acts as this like client-server kind of relationship, where it's able to like request for pages and ultimately serve you your web page. And that brings us into the document object model, also known as a DOM. And the DOM is a data structure. So many of you might not have taken, some of you might not have taken like 61B or 61A, but it's a data structure that the browser creates when loading a page. And essentially the DOM is made out of these things called elements and nodes, which are different objects that allow us to modify the CSS and the structure of HTML that is inside of the DOM. And it is made up of HTML tags, anywhere from paragraphs to divs to headers. And it's also joined by their content. So each tag is a different object. So for example, a D1 tag would be a different object. And then if you have a D2, H2 tag instead of your H1, that'll be a different object inside of that H1 tag. So basically, each tag encloses its children. And yeah, so here's a small little example. So we have HTML as the encapsulating tag, right? And then we have a head tag and a title tag. So the head is a child of the HTML tag, which means that the DOM will see that the head is a child of the HTML, and then we have the title as a child of the head tag. So yeah, that's the relationship between that. And then we also have a body tag, which is a child of the HTML tag. So we're gonna look into this a little bit more. So we can actually traverse the DOM, and it's in the form of a tree data structure. So a tree data structure, for those of you who might not be familiar, consists of like a root, which is like the starting point, and then it goes down into these little branches. It basically branches out like a fan, and then it ends up at leaves. So using this tree data structure, we can actually go down the DOM, and we can also go up the DOM. So we can start from, for example, in the last slide, we had the HTML, and we can go down to the head, and then go down to the title, and visit the different tags. So it forms this parent-child relationship, as well as this root-leaf relationship that consists of different branches. So yeah, we won't go into too much into data structures in this class. Obviously, this is web development, not like 61B or anything. But essentially how this works is how the browser or the DOM is viewed is it consists of a root, in this case HTML, then head, title, so forth, as well as different text that's contained. And then on the right, we have the tree version. So if we want to go down to, for example, this unordered list tag, we can go down from HTML to body and just go down the different nodes and the elements until we reach the element that we want. So I'm just going to do a quick demo on how this works. Okay, so up over here we have our HTML code, and essentially if we were to add different things, such as let's add a div, well, right over here, we have the div inside of our body. And then inside of that, let's say if we add some text. Hello. So now that text will be inside of the div because it is between the two div tags. We can also add more things. For example, a span. And that's going to be also contained inside of our div. And so now we can see kind of like how the relationship of all the different elements works. And like, let's say we can add more like h2, h2. So if we were to visualize this, so div and h2 are like siblings. They're not, it doesn't have like the parent-child relationship, but instead they're kind of adjacent to each other. So you might be wondering, why is this so important? How could we use this to actually build our websites and make some pretty interesting features? Well, we can use JavaScript to modify the DOM. So we had this tree that I talked about, and we can use JavaScript to change the different parts of the tree, change the different elements inside the tree, and ultimately change its CSS. So again, like, why are we doing this? So things such as interactions. For example, let's say you want to click on a checkbox, and when you click on the checkbox, you want some like some new text to open up, or maybe like a new div or new like image to show up. Well, we can actually create elements, for example, like an image, and then add it to our tree. So essentially, we'll be able to create new elements and show those. We can also do cool things like, let's say we want to hover over something, and you can actually make it so in your JavaScript, if you hover over something, it'll change the font of, like it'll change the font, or you can change like the color of your text. We can also do things like resizing. So for example, if we hover over something, you can resize the CSS, change the font size, things like that. And also like transition. So maybe if you scroll away from something, maybe like it'll like fade away, or things like that. So it's pretty useful. It's actually really useful to do, especially if you want to make your page more like alive and want to be able to like change your CSS as you interact with the page. So the thing that really helps us do this is the document. And the document is a globally available variable. And essentially it's like an API. So it has a lot of different functions you can call, and different properties that allow you to modify the DOM and interact with both the HTML and CSS. So that being said, there are a lot of methods available. We're going to go into some of them, not all of them, because there really are a lot. So I encourage you guys to all check out the documentation, especially when you're doing your assignments or even for your projects. It's really useful to do. And additionally, one more thing to note is that later on in the course, you're going to be working with React. And using the DOM is like in this way, using the document variable, it's more typical to use it with just like vanilla JavaScript, because there are other ways to modify your DOM in React. And yeah, basically it's like you want to use it more for like vanilla JavaScript when you're doing that. And so yeah, so now we're going to go into some methods. Some of them are really useful, and like we can use those in our like projects. And yeah, yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Sure.
So, you said that like you can use JavaScript to modify the DOM with things like interactions, resizing, and transitions.
Yeah.
You showed like the structure of a tree. I'm wondering what specifically in the tree gets like modified.
Yeah. So let's say right here, we have our HTML body. We have a section, navigation, unordered list, and then like some lists. So suppose we want to make it so, let's say we click on a checkbox, and we want another list item to appear. So we want another bullet point to show up. So something pretty interesting we can do is when we click on the checkbox, we can make it so that you can create a new list element and you can add it to your tree. So essentially what happens is this unordered list, instead of having 3 children, it'll have 4 children. So it'll add like one more list. So you're kind of like modifying the way like you're adding another leaf, like another element to this tree, if that makes sense.
Based on the actions of the user, something
Yeah.
like that. Okay.
Yeah. So like suppose if someone like interacts with something, like clicks on something, then a button or something like that, then you can actually like add in different things like this. Hopefully that answers your question. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay. Yeah, so the first method we're going to go over is document.querySelector. And this was really useful because it allows us to return the first element that matches the CSS specified. So basically what we're going to be doing with this is you pass in a selector. So you might have seen in your CSS homeworks or in the lectures, for example, like if you do period, like when you're in your CSS, you might do like period and then like some like class name. So we can refer to a selector as doing the same thing. So if we were to pass in into these parentheses like period, like red text or something, it'll refer to that CSS. We're going to look into it in just a second. And this is important because it allows us to modify the element CSS and its properties. So here's a small little example. Up there we have our style, and we make a class called red square. And we assign a width of 100 pixels, a height of 100 pixels, and a background color of crimson. So right below that, we have a div that sets its class to red square. And we have more JavaScript below that. And so we see the method that I was just talking about earlier, document.querySelector. And the way it works is it takes in the CSS class. It can be a CSS class, it can be a CSS name, it can be an ID, it can even be a tag. So in this case, we just have the class because we have the period, and it's called red square. So what that does is it takes in that whole element and it assigns red square equal to that element. So anything we want to like modify the element, for example, it's like its CSS, its styles, its class name, we are now able to do that in our JavaScript. So right here we have red square dot style. So we're referring to that square style, and we're setting the background color to lime green. So initially it was crimson. Well, using JavaScript, we're able to change its background color to lime green. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions about that? Okay, cool. So that being said, there's also another method called document.getElementById. So this one's like the previous one, except it's much more specific. So query selector, you can use anything. You can use a tag. You can pass in a class name. You can pass in IDs. It's very like versatile in that way. And one of the big things about query selector is that you might have maybe you'll have things with like multiple class names. For example, you'll have maybe a like a div with like the same class name as a paragraph tag, and you can actually refer to like specific tags. So like p dot like red square. So it would be like specifically like the paragraph's red square, not just like in general. But right here we have get element by ID, and that's a lot more specific because it only takes in an ID. So IDs are unique, right? And it will get that matching tag in the DOM, and it will return the first element with that ID. And as a parameter, it takes an ID as a string. And just like the previous one, it also allows us to modify this element CSS and its properties. So here's a little short example. We have some more JavaScript, And in that, we do document.getElement by ID, and we pass in the ID name called demo. And so this basically like returns that object, that it returns that element that we want. And when you do .inner HTML, it will like inner HTML, like the way that works is it changes like the text. So we might have something called hello initially, and then after running this, the tag with the ID demo will change its text to hello world. So I hope like maybe you guys can like see now, like suppose like we can do these interactions where in our JavaScript we might have like some methods that change things around, and by doing things like change the inner HTML, we're able to change the text, among many other things. So yeah, what can we do this? What can we do with this? So we can change the inner HTML, like I just said, the style, so anything in the entire CSS, background color, font size, yeah, and additionally we can change its class name too. So we might set a class name initially, and we want to change a different class. Well, it allows us to do that too. And there's a lot more. You can always just check out the documentation online to find creative ways to use this. And yeah, so here's some other methods that we can use. There's also document.getElements by class name. So this one is like the get element by ID, except it takes in a class name, and additionally it returns an array. So this is pretty useful because like many times we'll have an item or an element with a variety of different class names, or sorry, with a variety of different tags that all have the same class name. So you'll have a bunch of like red text or something like classes. So this returns an array, and essentially you'll have a variety of different tags that are returned by this. And this is similar to the next one, which is document.getElements by tag name, which also returns an array. And we can pass something in like div or span into the parameters of this in order to return each and every div that is in our HTML code. And the third one is document.createElement, and it takes in a tag, for example, like div. And we'll see this in the next slide, but essentially this creates a new element. Like I said earlier, like we can create a new element and add it to our DOM tree, which makes it like visible to people who are viewing our website. And now we're just gonna do a short little demo. Oh. All right, can everyone see the code? Everyone in the back, fine? Okay, cool. So I'll just walk us through. So we just have some basic HTML. We have a div, and we set the ID equal to introduction. We have a class of red text, which just changes the color of the text to red. We have an h1 that has a class of blue text, which sets the color to blue. And we have an h2 with the ID body2 and the class red text. And it has some text in it as well. So now we're going to see how this kind of works. And we're going to get started with trying out the query selector. So how we do this is we typically do like var or like let, and we can create an element. So elm equals, so we use our document. That's our like the bread and butter, the main like object that has all of our methods and our functions. So document.query selector. And suppose we want to let's see. So say we want to change like right here. We want to change this color to I don't know. Let's do it to white. So in our parentheses, we can just pass in a class. So period, just like we would do in regular CSS, and red text. So what this will do is grab the first element with the class of red text. So there's two right here, but it will still check and it will take the first one. So then we can change the style. So earlier I said like you can do like elm.style, and then we can change the color, just accessing the like your CSS, and set that to white. And we can run it, and as you can see, it changes it to white. So you might be asking like, how can I get this one, right? It has the class of red text, which is the same as this one, but if this one only returns the first one, how can we get this one instead? So there are two ways to do this, or there's multiple ways. Earlier I talked about like get elements by class name. You can do that and return an array and index the array to get like that element. Or we can even make this more specific. We can actually do something like h2.redText and set that to white. So it's right here, but it's set to white. So you can be more specific with query selector, and that's what makes it really, really popular and really powerful, because we can be really specific and get specifically like the elements that we need and the ones that we want to change. So I'll change this back to like pink or something. And yeah, then there's also get element by ID. This is a lot more like, it's a lot more specific, or I guess it's like only refers to IDs, but it's also useful too. And also like one of the more popular ones that people use when using JavaScript. So I'll just do var elem2 equals document dot get element by ID. And for this, we can actually just grab an ID. So let's do introduction. And we can change different properties for this too. Let's do elem dot inner HTML. So like inner HTML, it changed the text. So we can pass in a string, and right now it's introduction. Let's make it hello or welcome. And what it will do is, oh yeah, sorry, good catch. Okay, so elm2. So right here, it changes the welcome. Yeah, so you can make like a lot of different interactions with this, and oh yeah, so we can also change the class name. So let's just use elm2. So elm2 dot actually let's use the let's get red text, and we can add in like we can change the class to be equal to, let's do blue text. So right here we actually change the class to blue text, and we see that how it changed the color to blue now because it's now part of this CSS class. And finally, all at the bottom. So this one's a little bit more complicated doing create element, because it really like it forces you to think about like the DOM and like the tree. So let's do this. Okay, so var elem3 equals document dot create element, and like I said before, for this you just want to pass in a tag. Let's just try it. Let's just do a div. But this is not enough because we haven't actually added it. We just created it. It just exists, but we haven't added it to our tree. So we can set its properties. Let's do style and set the color to black, or it's already black, green. And we could set the background color to black, and we can also set the HTML to be equal to new node or new element. Okay, so we have our element, we set some of its CSS, but we still haven't added it. So to do that, we have to do something like document dot append child. And basically what that does is, you don't have to worry about this too much, but it is needed when you're trying to create this element and add it to your website. So basically append child just adds it to the tree. Like imagine you're like appending like a ligament or something. It's your append child, and then you can do elm3. Okay, wait. Wait, let me. Sorry, I think I forgot the name of the thing. Okay, so I forgot the name of the the method, but essentially there's like a way to like, it's like append something. So I'll get back to you on that. But essentially it allows you to add another element to your CSS or to your page. And yeah. And yeah, so there's a way to modify multiple elements at once as well. So you'll have a lot of different paragraphs, or we'll have a lot of divs. But essentially to modify multiple at once, you can use a loop, and you can leverage some of the methods that return an array object. For example, like get elements by class name or tag. And for example, something like this, we have a lot of lists, like bullet points, right? And to be able to like access all of them is really important. Oh yeah, there's a question in the back.
I searched it up and I think it says document.append child, but LM3.
Okay. Like document.append child.
I don't know, it just said like instead of document, you would put like whatever you define it after.
Oh wait. Oh okay.
And then inside the parentheses, you get like your tag or something.
I think it's body. Oh yeah, there it is. Okay. So yeah, you're just adding it to your document and then your body. So right here we have it show up. Thank you. Yeah, so this is something you can use whenever, like, for example, like I used a checkbox example previously, but let's say you like click on the checkbox or button and we want something to show up. So this is the way you can do that. You can also find a lot of like different documentation online if you ever forget or want to do more like complex things. And yeah, so suppose you have a lot of like different bullet points and we want to modify them. So in our JavaScript, we can do query select all, which is another method that we can use in order to return an array of classes. In this case, the class JS-target. Okay, and we can iterate through, and for each of the elements inside of that array, we can change the inner text. Inner text is like, it's kind of like inner HTML, but like inner HTML, you can like pass in like HTML inside of the string. For example, like if you want to make things bold, whereas inner text is like purely just like the words. Like you'll only change the words of it. So yeah, there's a lot of different things. Like I really like highly recommend you guys all search for the documentation because there's a lot of different ways you can interact with it. And yeah, so basically what this will do is for each of these tags that have this specific class JS target, it'll just change the text of it from unchanged to modified by JavaScript. Yeah, so now we'll have Amir talk about window object.
We'll also break for like 3 to 5 minutes. You guys can talk amongst yourselves. Or if you have any questions about anything that Neil just said, you can come up and ask us.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions?
Or if you guys have questions on the homework or anything,
Yeah.
I know you guys are posting a lot about like your Git submissions, so just let me know. and we'll come back in like 5 minutes.
Sure.
All right, cool. Let's go. All right, cool. We're gonna go ahead and get started with the next section. These slides are also posted on the lecture thread if you guys haven't already seen it. Anyway, we're gonna get started with the window object. So thanks to Neil for explaining the DOM. It's like a super important. It's very important to know when you're like designing your website and understanding like the layers of your document, what you're actually going through when you're layering your HTML. So the window object actually represents an open window of a browser, and it is the parent object of the entire DOM and the topmost layer of it. So we can use window objects to create and manipulate windows out of our browser. So we're gonna jump into a demo real quick. Also, I encourage you guys to follow along with this just because this demo is pretty cool. And I'm going to showcase a lot of things. And later on, when you're coming back and you're like going through this section on your own, it's kind of hard to remember everything unless you have the code to reference it. And we're not really posting this code anywhere from the demos. So I don't know. It's kind of good to kind of get experience with it firsthand when you're here. So I'm going to save this. This up. All right. Start off. Cool. I'm also going to showcase something in VS Code that we haven't seen before. And essentially what I'm going to show is I'm going to layer the script inside of the body instead of creating an entirely separate file where I put all my JS in there. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create two buttons. Let's put the first button as create window. And let's give it some onClick function. We talked about onClick functions earlier in the HTML lecture, but just as a refresher, onClick functions is essentially a built-in attribute for buttons in the HTML. When you're writing HTML, that essentially you can define functions and you can give buttons generic functions to essentially perform on onClick. So the onClick button that we're going to create here is actually unique and that we're going to create ourselves. So first we're going to give it an onClick function. We're going to call this onClick function open win. And it's going to create some window. We're going to create a second button. Inside the second button, we're going to say resize window. So intuitively, the first button is going to create some window, and the second button is going to resize it. And then let's call this onClick function resize window. Cool. And then as you guys have seen before in the last lecture, I talked about putting a script tag at the end of your body and essentially linking that script to some file where we put all of our JS that's going to be governing our HTML and our website. But instead of doing that, we can actually put the script tag inside of the body of your body tag. Now this isn't like normally good practice. Just for this demo, I'm showing you guys this. If you guys are trying to like test something out real quick, maybe you don't want to add like 3 different files to your desktop and kind of get cluttered with all these files, you can do it this way. Again, I would suggest against it, but just for this like little demo, I'm going to show you guys how to do it. So we're going to initialize some variable. We'll call it my window. And we're going to create our function using the standard methods that I talked about last lecture. And we're going to call it open win. And inside of this function, we're going to initialize my window to some window object. And so don't worry about everything that's going on right now. I'll explain it. Just copy it down, and I'll showcase what it does in just a second. Okay. Yeah, question. Sorry? Yeah, I can zoom in. Is that better? Cool. Okay, any questions on the code we just wrote before we dive in? I'll explain it all in a second. Actually, let me explain it right now. So essentially what we just did is we created these 2 buttons, and we set them to some, we gave them some inner text that Neil was talking about as an attribute. The first one's create window, the second one's resize window, and we gave them both onClick functions. Now the onClick functions, we only defined one of them, and I'll show you what it does in a second. But essentially what I'm trying to showcase is we're using this window object, and we're opening a new window in our browser, and we're passing in these parameters. And essentially what these parameters are saying is that we're opening it to some, these two ones, you guys can read about it. I honestly forget what I'm passing in, but all I know is that one of them is a URL. And what we're saying is just open some browser to some blank URL and set that window to a width of 100 and a height of 100. So let's open Chrome real quick and let's test this out. So let's find our demo one. Where do we put this guy? Awesome. Cool. They don't see this? Let's try zooming in. Cool. You guys can all see this. So we create two buttons. If I do resize window, nothing happens. And we're like, why? Well, because although we gave resize window an on-click function, we haven't initialized it to anything. So it's looking inside of our JavaScript and it's like, where's this on-click function, resize window, and like we don't have one. But we did do a create window on-click function. So when I click create window, it actually opens us a window. And if I take it out of the browser, sorry about that. Wait, let's open this up again. Okay. If you guys can see this, it opens us a blank window. And we perform this with the onClick function by saying window.open, which is a built-in function that's basically opening a new window, and we set the width to 100 and the height to 100. So let's say we set it to like 150 instead, and the height to 200. We say create window. It opens a differently sized window. It's pretty small, so you guys aren't going to be able to see the differences, but we'll do resize in just a second. That's going to showcase how we can actually resize this window as well. So now let's define another function, and let's call it resize window. And what we're doing here is we're going to reset the parameters of the my window size, and we'll say my window.resize to, and we'll do 300 by 300, and we'll also focus this window. So if we save our code, we'll refresh this. We'll go back to our browser, we'll create a new window, and it creates another window with these weird dimensions. And then if we resize the window, it'll resize and become a little bigger. Did you guys all see that? Let's create another window. Now, what did we just do here? Well, first, we created a window, and we told our website to say, OK, inside of our browser, create another window object and set it to these parameter sizes. So we did that, and then we said resize. So on this button, we passed in this onClick function, resize window. It looked into our JavaScript. It found this function resize window, and we said my window.resize to, and we set my window to this window we just created right here. And then when we resize it, we're resizing it to different parameters. Now let me show you something. Let's say we create two windows. We're creating one window, and we created a second window. Oops. We'll put them side by side. When I hit resize window, it's only going to resize the second window. The reason for this is because when we created that second window, we reset my window to that second window. So when I'm selecting resize, my window has already been forgotten about, the first one, because we just reinitialized it to a second window object. So when we do resize window, we're only resizing the second one. So if you guys wanted to resize both, you would have to store both of them somewhere, and then you'd have to go through all the previous creations of my window and change all of them. And you can use techniques that Neil just talked about for changing multiple elements inside the DOM. So that's everything you guys need to know about Windows. Question?
What you talked about earlier, the fact that like the first one you created doesn't move.
Yeah.
Or like this resize, is that what the my window without focus does?
No, that's basically just a property of So in this function, open window, right? When our script is running, it's saying my window, and we're initializing it to some window, right? So let's say we create window. We're clicking on this button, and then our script open window is running. So then it's initializing my window to something. But then when we click it again, we're reinitializing my window to something else, right? So a new object is being passed into my window, which is why the first one is not being kept track of anymore. Even though we see that technically in our browser, that window object, basically the reference to that window object is lost. Does that make sense? Cool. Focus does something. You guys can read about it like on your own time if you want. Resize too also. There's a bunch of different like methods that you guys can all like read about and read documentation about. But this is just to showcase like one property of the DOM and the highest level of the DOM, basically. The topmost layer of the document object model. Okay, cool. Created a bunch of windows. Okay. Let's go back to, is it on? Okay, yeah. Awesome. Okay, now we're going to talk about events and listeners. So let me hide this. An event is created every time certain events happen. So for instance, we just talked about an event where like an on-click happened, right? We're always looking for events, and essentially when we're developing our website, we're always constantly looking for events to act upon. So events are just something that we create whenever we want something to happen. Listeners respond to these events by having what are called event listeners. So we give an event listener a function to run whenever an event happens. So you guys just saw when we created that button in our HTML that we named some event on click. And the event listener was our on click function open window or resize. These are all known as event listeners because we're responding to some event that just happened. So we're going to go into another demo where I'm going to show you guys some other really cool and useful and hopefully more applicable events that you guys can use. So let's go back into VS Code. Let's open up another file. Let's name this one demo 2. Awesome. And let's get started. Okay. So let's define some button. And again, you guys can, the code really like isn't too long here, so you guys can definitely follow along if need be, or you guys can just listen in. But I'm going to show you guys some cool stuff that you can do. Again, some other on-click functions and things that are really useful when you're going to be developing your websites. So let's create some button. And we're going to call this button, or give it some text, button 1. Oops. Button 1. And let's give it an ID. And we're going to call this button, button 1. Oh, I hate the resizing. It's so annoying. Okay. Then in this script, we're going to look for this button by going through our document object, and we're going to say get element by ID. And let's find this button, button 1. So Neil just talked about this, but essentially in this script, we're telling our website to go through our document and find this ID, button 1. And then now we have it right here, and we're going to do something to it. So let's do something called add event listener. So adding an event listener is exactly what we just talked about, right? We're essentially going to be adding some listener to some event that we defined, and we're going to perform some action, hopefully when we want this button to do something, right? So right now this button does nothing. It just shows up on the page, says button 1. But right now let's add an on-click using this event listener parameter or this event listener class. So The first parameter is the event that we want to trigger this on. And the second is the listener function. So this is essentially what we're going to be doing when this event is triggered. But what we can do in JavaScript, and the reason why JavaScript is really nice, is we're actually going to define a function right now within this function call. So let's create some function, and let's pass in some event into this function. Don't worry too much about the code right now. I'll explain it right after. And let's say that we want to make an alert that just says, you clicked on okay, I just resized. Cool. So we just defined this button, and then in this script, we're going through the document, finding some ID button 1. We're adding an event listener, and the event we're going to be triggering this function on is click, and then we're passing in some function that we want to do, this listener, to this event click. And in this function, we're saying we want to throw some alert, and we're going to say you clicked on, and inside of this little thing that we talked about in last lecture is we're saying event.target.innerText. So what this is saying is event.target. Target is the tag that the event is oriented from. So it's a button. So essentially, this event, what we're passing into it is this click, and we're targeting the inner text inside of this button that we're passing into this function. If you guys are confused at all, again, you guys can read more about this if you guys just look up the documentation on your own. Also, it's in like the content notes. But this is essentially when you want to query some specific attribute inside of the element that you just looked at. You follow this procedure of taking the event and then targeting some attribute, and we're targeting inner text. Okay, cool. So let's look at what this does. Let's switch back to Chrome. Okay. You guys can all see that? Awesome. So when we click this button, it does exactly what we want. It says, this page says you clicked on button 1. So we just made some alert, and it's saying you clicked on button 1, which is exactly what we're doing, right? Because we were targeting the inner text of that element that we passed into the function, and the inner text of that element was button 1, because we defined that when we defined the button at the beginning of the HTML. So cool. Any questions on this first part? All right. Now let's do something else. So now let's say we want a button. Oh, what is happening? Let's say we want a button, and this time we're just going to be giving it a class instead of an ID. And we're going to call this class event button, and we're going to say click me, exclamation mark. And now we're going to access this button in a different way than we just did. Okay. And we're going to create some variable called button. And essentially, we're going to go through our document. We're going to query selector, which is, again, the function that Neil talked about if we're trying to find some specific element or class, essentially. What query selector actually does is it looks through our document and it finds the first instance of this class that we pass in. So the class that we're passing in is event button. And what this function is going to do is it's going to look through our document and it's going to look through all the instances of event button and it's going to pick the first one of them that it finds inside of our document. But luckily, we only have one element inside of this event button class. So we know that it's going to select this button here. So this is just another way of gaining access to some element that we created in our document, right? So in our body, we have these two elements. And the first time we pulled the ID or like a reference to this element is by going through the document and then getting the element by ID. I'm just showing you guys another way to get an element instead of using an ID, using a class. And when you use a class, you have to use query selector. Okay. Now we're going to do the same thing, except this time we actually have a reference to this button. So we're just going to say button. We're going to say add event listener. And we're going to pass in essentially the same thing that we did last time, right? So we're adding an event listener to this button. We're going to say listen when we click on something, or when we click on the button. And we're going to create some function that automatically is called when we click on this button. We call this type of function a callback function. And then we're also going to do another alert where we say, hey there, you, oh. All right, cool. If you didn't laugh, then you're not following along. Cool. Now let's look at our HTML. Now we created the second button, and we have this onClick function. So it tells us we're looking cute today, which is pretty nice. And if you ever want to write some HTML to make yourself feel better, now you know how to do it. Perfect. Does anyone have any questions on this segment? No. Okay, cool. Now I'm going to show you guys one last event listener. But instead of this time of using buttons, we're kind of tired of buttons. We're going to make something a little more interactive, which is actually an input. So an input, when you go to a website, let's say like, you know, you have to just like put in your name and your last name and like some email or whatnot. So how does the website actually know what you're putting into that input? Or like, how does the website store or interact with that entry that you're putting into that, you know, text box? So let's see how it does that. So we're going to create some input using the input tag. And the input tag has a couple attributes. The first one we're going to name is placeholder. And we're going to say type into me, exclamation mark. And the second attribute, we're going to give it as a class. And this class, we're going to say input to copy. And then we're going to display what's being put in this input inside of a paragraph tag. So let's set the default value of this paragraph to nothing has happened yet. Because if this hasn't changed, then our user hasn't typed anything into the input. And let's give this also a class so we can find it later in our document. Again, we don't really have to do that because there's only one paragraph tag. But let's say we added like 15 different paragraph tags later. We give them all different classes. Naming it is going to make it a lot easier to find that instance of that paragraph. And of course, we can give it an ID if we wanted to. Let's just do a class this time around. So let's name this guy paragraph to copy to. Cool. Let's go back into our JavaScript. And this time, we're going to create some variable called input. And we're going to find our input inside of our document. So we're going to say document, again, query selector, because we're trying to find an instance of a class. And we're going to go input to copy. Oops, I put equal sign here. Okay. And then let's also take our paragraph tag. So we're going to again do, oops, document.query selector dot p to copy to. Also note that I'm putting a period when I'm trying to find a class in the same way that you're trying to find some class name in your CSS. That's how we're also doing it when you're using the function query selector. Okay, so now let's do something to this. Let's add an event listener to our input. And it's the same way that we were adding an event listener to our button, except this time we're just going to create or listen to some event that's happening in the input, and we're going to act when we hear this event happening. So it's called an event listener. And just so you guys know, the events are predefined. If you really want to look up the HTML elements and look up all their events, there's probably like 100 different events for every single for every single element in HTML. The very common ones are like click, or for add event listener, it's like key up. There's probably like hover, a bunch of other stuff. So if you're really interested, you can look at them. But these are like just the really most useful ones, and probably the only ones you're ever going to use for the most part. But yeah, input has a really common one, which is called key up. And oops. And essentially what key up means is that when you're typing on your keyboard inside of that input, when you press on a key and then the key is released, it registers to your computer. So your website is saying, listen to this event that's key up, and then we're going to do something after this key has just been registered. So when this happens, we're going to call a function. And then we're going to say this paragraph that we just defined right above, we're going to find the inner text of this paragraph, and we're going to set it to the input.value. So essentially, every single time the user types something into the input, every time their key is lifted off of a letter, it's going to trigger the event key up, and we added an event listener to this event, which is going to call this function, which we just defined, and it's going to say the paragraph that we defined, the inner text of that paragraph, set it to whatever the value is of this input that we just are referencing. So now let's go into, let's also clear this out just because it'll look nicer. And let's go back into our website. Cool. So as you guys can see, we have this input in here, and we have this paragraph. Nothing's happened yet. So let's start typing something. Let's type. So as you can see, essentially as I'm typing, every time my key is being lifted, it's triggering this event, which is then displaying whatever the value is of this input into this paragraph tag. So you guys can't see this, but oops. If I'm going to tell you when I'm pressing down on the key right now. I'm lifting up. That's essentially what key up is trying to show you. Cool. Any questions on this part? Or any of the parts we just talked about in this demo? Okay, awesome. Let's go out of this. So we just added event handlers inside of our script. You can actually add inline event handlers. So it basically just does the same thing as adding event listeners inside of your script. Instead, you can only add one event at a time when you're actually like creating the element inside of your body. So I'm not going to go through the demo with you guys again, but last time, as you guys saw, we defined some button. We got the element by ID. We added some event listener, and then we passed in some function that was an alert that basically triggered on the event of click, and we had the onClick function. Another way to do it is actually to define the onClick function inside when you're creating the button element. And this is essentially what we saw when we created that click function at the very beginning of my demo. But these are just two different ways to do it. Again, I'm showing you guys a bunch of different ways to do the same thing last lecture and this lecture. You guys can pick and choose. Personally, I think this looks a little more readable just because you're kind of pushing everything into your script section, so you're not doing a whole lot of like operations when you're defining the HTML element. But you guys can pick and choose what you want to do. And again, this is all for reference on the slides that are posted and in the notes. So if you ever want to look back on like how we did it or the different ways to do it, you can always do that as well. So now we're going to talk about event delegation. So there's this concept called event bubbling. And essentially, after firing a click handler attached to a target, the browser always moves upward inside the DOM and executes any click handler attached above it. So essentially, let's say you have like 5 buttons layered within each other. In the CSS lecture, I talked about cascading and how different elements are stacked upon each other and the different types of parent classes and child classes. So essentially, this is that same concept just in HTML when we're working with the DOM. And so when an event triggers, you can also trigger every single event in the parent class until it reaches the root, which is the document and the window. So this can be described by this right here, if you guys can see this. So let's say we have some element button that we added some onClick function to. When we click on that button, some event is going to trigger, and it's going to bubble up our DOM ladder until we reach to the root. If there's no events above it, nothing's going to happen. But if we have some events nested in certain events, then it will constantly bubble up and trigger each and every event until it gets to the root. So this is a bit of an intuitive concept, but I'll explain it with a demo right now. Oops. Let's go back to our VS Code. It's our new file. We'll call this one demo3. And this one's pretty simple. You guys can follow along if you want to. Oops. We'll call it body. Let's start off by creating some div element. And we're going to call this div button container. And in this button container, we're going to make a bunch of buttons that essentially are child elements of this div element. Let's make a bunch of buttons. Let's call it 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Cool. So all we did is we created like some container and we stored 5 different buttons in it. Now let's write some script. And let's say, let's select this div element again using document.querySelector, which again is basically just looking inside the document for the first instance of this class button container, and we're selecting it. Now let's add an event listener to this div element. So you guys might be thinking like, wait, how are we going to add some onClick function or some event handler to this div element? But thinking of the concept of bubbling and cascading, if we click on some child class, it's going to not only trigger all those event handlers, but it's also going to trigger all of my parents' event handlers and my parents' event handlers. So what we can do is we can nest a whole bunch of buttons inside of one container, define that container of buttons to have one type of onClick function, and then all the buttons nested inside of this div container is going to, when they're clicked, is going to trigger their parents' onClick function. So let's add an event listener. That's click, obviously, because we're working with buttons. And let's define some function. Inside of this function, we're going to say text. Okay, cool. So we've seen all this before. Let me move this out of the way. We've seen all this before. In our script tag, we're saying, okay, go to the document object, and we're going to find this class button container. Return the first instance of this button container class, which is this div element right here. Then we're adding an event listener to it, which is the click function. So we're waiting for the click function to happen, and then we're passing in a function that's going to execute when we hear this event happening. So we're waiting around, and we hear, okay, the click just triggered. Let's dive into this function. We're going to send an alert to our website saying, hey, you just clicked on button, and then we're passing in the inner text of the button that was just clicked. And we'll see how this works right now. Let's go here. Okay. So we have 5 buttons. And when we click on button 5, it says, hey, you clicked on button 5. 4 says 4. 3 says 3. 2 says 2. 1 says, hey, you clicked on button 1. So why does this happen? Again, because we gave this container, our button container, this event listener, essentially every time we're executing some event in the child of this parent container, it will bubble up to our parent, and then that event handler will also execute. And the reason why it's passing in the specific number of the button that we clicked on is because of this line right here. So we're saying the event that just happened, we're finding the target of that event, i.e. the button that we just passed into this event, and we're saying find the inner text of that target, which is the element that was passed into the event. Or rather, the element that triggered upon the event happening. Is there any questions on this section? Anything at all? Yeah?
Just to confirm, it's because we put like all of the buttons in the button container class and we did query selector dot button container that happened. It's not like if we did something specifically to one of the buttons, it would have pressed them all.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's a great point. So let's say instead, let's say we gave this like, let's say we didn't name this div, and then we put class button container inside of just one of the buttons. And let's go back to our, so when we do 2, 3, 4, 5, nothing happens. But if we do 1, it says, hey, you clicked on button 1. And the reason for that is because these buttons can't see each other because they're all just children nodes that can't look at each other inside of the DOM. But when they're all nested inside of this greater container and an event triggers, again, all the events will bubble up, and then their parent class's event will trigger. which then triggers this event being called. So this is just one way to apply one event handler to a multiple amount of elements. Yeah.
For your second input on add event listener, like at the hood,
Yeah.
could you somehow like basically define the function outside of that and just put the name of the function in that second parameter?
Yeah, totally. We can do that right now. So let's say we want some function test. Let's pass in some event. Let's say alert. Okay. Let me think about this. I think this is going to work. Let me see. Okay. Yeah, so it does work.
And so you don't pass an event when you write it in, you just write the name of the function.
Yeah, so I was thinking that, and the reason I don't think so is because this is already accepting some parameter event. So I think when you put it in, it's basically being implicitly already passed an event. Yeah. Yeah.
To make clear, when we originally declare a function inside the like parentheses, we're not passing in anything either. We're just saying that event is the argument it's going to take in.
Exactly.
So it itself doesn't include.
Exactly. Yeah. The event that's being passed in is this click basically. So we're just waiting. The function is just waiting for that event to happen, and then we're performing or executing this callback function. Any other questions? I saw like a hand somewhere over here. Any questions? No? Okay. Cool. So that was the last demo. I'm sorry, we ran like 3 minutes over lecture. But real quick, just to wrap it up, this is all known as vanilla JavaScript. So we're right near the end of JavaScript. We have a JavaScript 3, and then we start on React. When you're working in React and you're working on front-end things, you're not really going to be at this low level of programming. You're not going to like define elements this way. This is just to let you guys know what's happening under the hood, and we're going to be working with like much higher levels of abstraction. But now you guys basically are close to having the fundamentals, everything you need to know of what's happening when you're writing these websites, when you're writing these programs. So just some quick announcements. Project 1 is due February 24th, which is in 2 days on Thursday. And then homework 3 on JavaScript is released, and it's due March 1st. Come to office hours if you guys have any questions. I think I'm going to move my office hours for this week because I had it on Monday to some other day. And yeah, if you guys have any questions, also come up and let me know or any concerns you guys have. So let me guys give you the code word real quick. Let me stop recording.